सहस्रशीर्षा पुरुषः सहस्राक्षः सहस्रपात् स भूमिं विश्वतो कृत्वा.
Thank you for listening to Light of the Vedas. This is your host, Sri Sachinandam Das. In our last episode, we discussed how the great sage Vyasadeva, after dividing the Vedas, gave the very essence of the Vedas in the form of the Srimad Bhagavatam, the Bhagavad Purana, to his son Shukadeva Goswami. And Shukadeva Goswami is a fantastic personality. He's liberated even within the womb, an extreme example of exalted consciousness and devotion. And he's wandering through the forests and the cities and jungles like a madman. The average people cannot recognize his glories. And therefore he's followed by children and young women who are making fun of him, making jokes and calling him names. And as he's walking through the forest, he enters into a clearing, and it's filled with hundreds of sages and highly powerful personalities. And they all see him, recognize who he is, recognize his glories, even from just the way he looks, his effulgence. And they have spiritual vision, and they're learned in the scriptures. Therefore they recognize this great personality, and they all immediately stand. And within this assembly are the great sages of the universe, including his own father, Vyasadeva, and his father's teacher, Narada, who we've already discussed. And also there is the Emperor Pariksit, the king, and he's there fasting unto death. And so today I'm going to speak a little bit about who Maharaja Pariksit is. And who he is described in the Bhagavad Purana itself. The Srimad Bhagavatam really begins where the Mahabharat ends. Those of you familiar with the Mahabharat know that it culminates in the battle of Kurukshetra. And it's essentially a fight between good and evil. You have the brothers, the Pandavas, fighting against their cousin brothers, the Kurus, or the Kauravas, headed by Duryodhana, who is a very evil and wicked personality, a murderer, who was trying to usurp the kingdom. And he was really unfit to rule the empire. And so the Pandavas, Krishna, who is an avatar of God, he essentially descended into the world for many purposes, but one of his purposes was to protect the world and orchestrate the downfall of the Kurus and exalt the Pandavas into their rightful position as rulers. And so he is also there on the battlefield of Kurukshetra. And that is where the Bhagavad Gita is spoken, which is very famous literature. It's often called the Bible of India. And we'll talk about the Bhagavad Gita more in a couple of episodes. But as this battle winds down and the Pandavas are victorious, then the Mahabharat ends. And so the Srimad Bhagavatam begins at that point. And so during the battle, or rather after the battle, one of the survivors, Ashvatthama, he's actually the son of Dronacharya, who's the guru of the Pandavas. And so these individuals are all intimately related. They're practically friends from childhood. And yet his father was killed in the battlefield, and he was very, very disturbed. So Ashvatthama, he's actually born as the son of a Brahmin. And Brahmins within the Vedic culture are very highly respected. They're the gurus, they're the teachers, they're the priests. So he's like a priest. And yet, because his father was killed in the battle, he was driven mad. He lost all good sense, and he became very wicked and desirous of revenge. And so the Pandavas, there's 5 Pandava brothers. There is Yudhishthira, who's the eldest, he's the king, and he's really, he's what's considered a Rajarshi. He's a Raja, he's a king, but he's also a Rishi, he's a sage. And he's a very kind and gentle individual. In fact, it's often said that he's a Jatashatru. It means there's no one in the world born, there's no one born in the world who's his enemy, right? Meaning he has no enemies. Of course, many people hated him and wanted to kill him and usurp his position, but he himself, he never saw anyone as his enemy. Even when these individuals were trying to poison his brothers and murder them and burn them alive in a house, and they even tried to basically rape his wife and humiliate her and strip her naked in the royal assembly. All these horrible things happened to him. And yet, even though he's a warrior and they're generally very passionate, and very quick to anger, etc., But he was actually extremely kind and gentle and forgiving, and he never held any fault against anyone. He's almost like King Solomon, he's got perfect judgment, and he's like a wise, devoted, saintly king. And then you have the second brother is Bhima, and Bhima is almost like Hercules, he's like this, he's a little bit quick to anger. He also has a very strong appetite for food, but due to various things that happened, he had the blessings of the power of 10,000 elephants. He's extremely powerful. Like he could grab a man and just crush his skull with his hand, like you'd crush a Pepsi can or something. And he's, huge, and muscular and gigantic. And so he's really like the strength, and he's very heroic and powerful among the brothers. And then you have Arjuna. Arjuna, the third brother. He is, and all of them are sons of gods. Arjuna is the son of Indra. And he's actually extremely devoted to Krishna, and he's Krishna's best friend, really. And he's perhaps one of the central characters of the Mahabharat. And he is an incredible hero. He's actually a great archer, but he's also a courageous warrior, and very moral and pure and kind. And he's really sort of like one of the central heroes of the Mahabharat, and a very heroic personality, an exemplary personality. But he's mostly known for his devoted relationship with Krishna. And then you have the two twin brothers, Nakula and Sahadev, who are also, very great personalities and great warriors as well. And so these 5 brothers, they all had 5 children. And whereas the opposing army, the dynasty of the Kurus, was destroyed in the battle, and there was no one sort of like living on, no future generations to perpetuate their dynasty, the Pandavas had their 5 sons. Practically everyone in the battle was annihilated on both sides, and yet the Pandavas survived. And a few people from the Kaurava side, the enemy side, they also survived, but no young children to sort of carry on the dynasty. So the Pandavas, their 5 children, they lived, and they were sort of staying in the camp next to the army. And then Ashvatthama, who was enraged at the death of his father, he did something very horrible. He snuck into the camp at night when the Pandavas were away, and he killed their children. And this is because he wanted to stamp out their dynasty. He had lost. His entire army was destroyed. All of his friends were destroyed, and his own father was killed in the battle. And he wanted revenge. He didn't want the Pandavas to be able to perpetuate their royal line. And so he massacred their children in their sleep. In fact, they were laying in their beds, and he came into their tent, and he actually had performed some sort of worship to certain gods, and therefore been blessed with this kind of power of being the destroyer. And he actually brutally massacred them, and he massacred many people in the camp. And he also massacred certain individuals that he had vendettas against. One of them, he dragged him out of bed and just kicked him to death. So it was a really brutal sort of thing. And so in the morning, and the Pandavas were away, and sort of like a separate arrangement in a separate camp some distance away. And in the morning when they found out, then Arjuna, this great hero, he mounted his chariot with Krishna, and they began chasing after Ashvatthama, who was now running, And Ashvatthama, he saw on the horizon, or from a great distance, he saw Krishna and Arjuna coming at him at a very fast speed, and he panicked because he knew, there's no escaping Arjuna. Arjuna is this incredibly powerful warrior. And so he invoked a weapon of the gods, an astra. Astra means weapon in Sanskrit, but there's these various astras that belong to gods. Like you have Indra or Agni, whoever the god may be, each god has his particular weapon. And the weapon's not just a physical object, it's a person. It's a lower god or a sub-god who's a servant of that god. And he serves them in the form of their weapon. And they're incredibly powerful. They're basically magic weapons. And if you're initiated into the mantra of that particular weapon, which the gods don't really give out their weapons, right? But, every once in a while the gods may give their weapon to somebody when they're giving them a benediction or very pleased with them. And therefore these weapons would sort of make their way into human society, and very few very powerful, learned individuals were given access to these weapons. And what they would do is it's basically a mantra that you're initiated into, and then you just take a regular arrow and you chant the mantra onto the arrow, and then that arrow becomes sort of imbued with the power of that god. And so Ashvatthama, he knew one of those mantras. He knew a mantra for the Brahmastra, or the weapon of Brahma. And Brahma is the creator god of the universe. And this is a very famous astra, because it's perhaps the most powerful among the astras of the gods of this universe. You have Brahma, Agni, Indra, Chandra. They all have their astras, but the Brahmastra is the most powerful. Of course, Lord Shiva and Vishnu also have their astras, and they're even more powerful. But the Brahmastra, it's compared to like a nuclear bomb, and it's a humongous, like a hydrogen bomb, right? So, but it's very accurate. Like you can pinpoint one particular individual. You chant the mantra and you say who you're trying to shoot, and it'll find that individual, and it can explode in an almost like a universal, a way powerful enough to destroy the universe practically, or it can explode in a small way just to kill one person. But either way, it's an extremely powerful astra. Now, if you are also initiated into that weapon, then you know how to stop it. You can chant mantras to withdraw it, right? And so, anyway, Arjuna and Krishna are galloping forward towards Ashvatthama, and all of a sudden he releases this Brahmastra, and they can see like fire kind of like rise up from all the horizons, and the sky become filled with light. It's this humongous nuclear bomb is about to explode right on top of them. And Arjuna prays to Krishna, please protect us. And Krishna advises him, fire your own Brahmastra. The Brahmastra, you fire it too. And then when they combine in the air, you can chant the mantra to counteract them and withdraw them, and then it will disappear. And that's what he did. He fired his Brahmastra, and it made this humongous ball of flame in the middle of the air that was burning, out into outer space, right? It was like heating the whole planet practically. People could feel it, you can imagine, for hundreds of miles away, right? It's incredible heat. And then he chanted the mantra to make the weapon disappear, and both of them disappeared. They sort of mixed together and then vanished. And so Arjuna came towards Ashvatthama on the chariot. He jumped off the chariot and he grabbed him and kind of like, subdued him and tied him up and put him on his chariot. And his intention, actually, what he wanted was to bring him forward before his wife, right? Because remember, Ashvatthama had killed his own child and killed the child of the children of his brothers. And he wanted to bring him forth to his own wife, and then Draupadi, and he wanted to execute him, right? Get vengeance, exact law and justice against this child murderer. And then he even told Draupadi that, for your own edification, I'll give you the head and you can stand on it, right? When you bathe your hair, because traditionally the women would bathe their hair as like part of the lamentation ritual, so like at the funeral when they're mourning, they're bathing their hair. And so you can stand at his head at the funeral and bathe your hair, right? And so anyway, they're all very angry and disturbed, obviously. This man just killed their children. So he brought the Ashvatthama bound in ropes and dragged him back to his family and threw him on the ground in front of all of them. And because these are individuals all great saints, immediately Draupadi, his wife, became filled with compassion, and she began to argue on Ashvatthama's behalf. And this man just killed her son. And she's arguing that, you can't kill him. First of all, he's the son of our teacher, right? And we know him. I mean, he's your friend, we know him for so long. And his mother, I know his mother. And I know that I'm feeling incredible pain because my son has been killed. But I don't want his mother to feel that pain if we kill him. And also we respect his father. His father's deceased. And I don't want to, I want to honor his father by not killing him. And also he's a Brahmin, he's the son of a priest. He's what's called a Brahma Bandhu. He's not considered a Brahmin or a priest himself. He's a criminal. But he's the son of a Brahmin, and therefore, in order to please the Brahmins as a class, we will be merciful to him. And in the scriptures it says, you shouldn't kill a Brahmin. And so Draupadi was saying like this, and in Yudhishthira, the eldest brother and the new emperor, and that individual who, he's greatly saintly and compassionate and kind, he agreed, that she's actually speaking very nicely, even though his son was killed as well. And therefore they were going to forgive him. But then Bhima, the sort of powerful, the hot-tempered brother, he actually came forward and he wanted him dead. No, this is wrong. He's a murderer. He just murdered children. We have to kill him. And so Krishna came to Arjuna, and, is Arjuna the one holding the sword, right? He came to Arjuna and he said, they're both right. What are you going to do? So sometimes Krishna, he'll leave things up to Arjuna, and he does this in the Bhagavad Gita as well. He instructs him, and then he tells him, do what you will, use your intelligence to figure out the right path, and use your free will to choose, because he's an avatar. He's God, and therefore he leaves things up to the soul to choose. Will you surrender to God? Will you not surrender to God? Right? So he's big on free will. He doesn't interfere with the choices that human beings make. And so he leaves it to Arjuna, his devotee, to solve. And Arjuna thinks, well, we have to kill him and not kill him. So there's a way to do that. We'll humiliate him, right? And we'll ostracize him. And these are considered proper punishments for a Brahmin. And for an individual like Ashvatthama who's been honored, dishonor is worse than death. It's like a kind of death in itself. And so he took his hair and cut it. It's like a top knot. Like you look in, I think there's that movie, The Last Samurai, where the samurai are depicted, they wear this top knot. And they're the warrior class, and it's like a sign of their virility, their honor, their status. And when it's cut from a samurai, it's like a great insult, and a great dishonor, and it's like worse than death. It's a painful experience. So it's the same thing with these Vedic Kshatriyas. He cut his hair, and this is a great humiliation. Also, Ashvatthama had a jewel that he wore on his head, like on his forehead. I think it was kind of like embedded in his head, and he cut this jewel from his head. And so he lost all of his luster and all of his power, and was humiliated. And then Ashvatthama was banished. He was driven into the forest, and he disappeared into the wilderness. And then the Pandavas and Krishna, they began to perform all of the funeral rites for those who had died in battle. And much philosophy was spoken to pacify the grieving. And Krishna prepared to leave for Dwarka, his city, which is on the western coast of India. And so, all the Pandavas, they had these sons, these 5 sons who were killed. But Arjuna also had another son named Abhimanyu. He was an incredibly powerful warrior. He was only 16 years old. And during the Battle of Kurukshetra, he personally fought against the most powerful among the enemies, all alone. But at that time, he was also killed. But before he was killed, he was married, and he had impregnated his young wife, Uttara. And so within her womb was the final child of the dynasty. He's the last child in the line of the Pandavas. And he was also then destined, as such, to be the emperor. After Maharaja Yudhishthira would die or leave the kingdom, then the plan was to hand it to this child. And so she came running towards Krishna as he's on the chariot preparing to leave, and she was begging him. And she's saying, there's a Brahmastra coming right at me. And they look and they can all see it. So apparently from the wilderness, Ashvatthama, wanting to kind of stamp out the line and kill this last child, he tried to abort the pregnancy. He wanted to shoot a Brahmastra and destroy her and destroy the child, right? And potentially kill them all, right? And so he fired his Brahmastra again. And this time it was right upon them. And Krishna he threw up his own weapon, the Sudarshan Chakra, and it immediately, protected them or shielded them all from the Brahmastra. And then this Brahmastra was trying to enter the womb, because remember, it can pinpoint a particular individual and kill them. And it was trying to enter the womb and kill the fetus. And Krishna entered the womb personally. Right? There's the super soul. He's the Paramatma within the heart of all living beings. And so in the size of a thumb, the Paramatma appeared before this fetus, before this young child, in the embryo, and protected him and like shielded him and caused the power of the Brahmastra to vanish. In fact, it's described, it's just like when the sun rises and the dew that's on the grass, when it just immediately sort of steams up, kind of steams into nothing. So similarly, when Vishnu appeared and protected him, this most powerful weapon, this Brahmastra, just kind of fizzled away and evaporated, right? And therefore this child became known as Vishnu Ratha. Ratha means protected, and so he's protected by Vishnu, as Vishnu personally saved his life. And he'd also seen this Vishnu form in the womb. He had a meeting with God, or a revelation of God in the womb, and therefore he was known as Pariksit, meaning like he's seen, and therefore he was always looking for Vishnu, even from his birth. He was trying to see that form again. He had a vision of God in the womb. It's a very powerful experience, and this is a very special child. And so he became known as Maharaja Pariksit. After all these events had subsided, he's a young boy being raised in the palace by his grandfather Arjuna and by all of his sort of grand uncles, Yudhishthir, Bhima, Nakula, Sahadev, and his mother, as well as the various gurus of the kingdom, Kripacharya, and these highly exalted personalities. He's being raised to be the next king. And he's a very saintly individual, like he's, in his play, he's absorbed in devotion. He would whereas most kids would play with balls and tag or, whatever, run around the palace, he would play by worshipping a deity of Vishnu. That was like his play. And so he's a highly exalted devotee, even from his birth. And it's also interesting, at the time when he was saved, his aunt, who's Queen Kunti, she's actually she's the mother of his grandfather. She's the mother of the Pandavas, his great-grandmother, something like that. And so she had actually offered prayers to Krishna at the time of his being saved. And these are very famous prayers. They're called the prayers of Queen Kunti, and they're known for their exceptional beauty and poetry. And so at the time of his birth, and the time of being in the womb, he's surrounded by all these great personalities, like this loving, exalted, pure devotees of God. And so at the time of his birth also, there was very auspicious indications. His astrology was done, and there was predictions of who he would be, even how he would die, and all the great and wonderful things he would do in his life. And so eventually the Pandavas, they grew old, and they left, they left to the Himalayas in order to trek into the wilderness and leave their bodies or die in spiritual consciousness. And, the Srimad Bhagavatam goes into great detail about this, how the different individuals at the end, who are the main personalities of the Mahabharat, how they ended their lives. And also Krishna, he also left. He ended his avatar incarnation. And so many of these things are discussed. But as soon as Krishna left, this avatar of God that is within the world, and this is about 5,000 years ago, then the age of Kali began, the age of materialism, the age of sin, the age of quarrel and hypocrisy. It's when human society degrades in consciousness into materialism. And this is also the same time that Vyasa began writing down and compiling the Vedas and disseminating them into human society, as we've discussed. And so, all these individuals had left, and Krishna had left, and then Kali Yuga began, and so Pariksit is really the first king of Kali Yuga. He's an emperor, and so he is seeing these influences of Kali begin, all the symptoms and things like that of degradation start to happen. And he's resisting against it, and he's actually very powerful. He's essentially stamping out this sinful influence as it begins to arise, and he more or less holds off the influence of Kali Yuga until his own eventual death. So he's a very powerful king. He's able to stave off this sort of cosmic, malevolent influence. And in the midst of it all, he also marries and has children. And his eldest son is King Janamejaya, who also is a very important personality historically. And so one day, Pariksit, he's out hunting, and the Kshatriyas or warriors, they used to hunt in order to hone their skills. Especially they would hunt like man-eating tigers and things that are genuinely dangerous. But basically, by going out into the forest, this gives them the capacity. They learn to hunt and track, and they're sort of pitting their skills against those of the wild, ferocious predators of the jungle. In fact, even up until recent times, there was a tradition in Jaipur where warriors or kings, they're expected to, almost like a rite of passage, to hunt a tiger with nothing but a dagger, right? They didn't use guns or anything like that. Like if you had to kill a tiger with a dagger, that's a pretty serious demonstration of your strength and your cunning, your capacity to survive, right? So, and this is what these kings would do. So you can imagine Pariksit, he's out there in the forest, carrying like a sword or maybe even just bow and arrow, and he becomes parched. Sometimes you can't find water, and he can't, he hasn't drinking, and you can, if you've ever experienced this, when you're very, very hungry, very thirsty, and very tired, you become very grumpy. And even though he's an exalted personality, his consciousness becomes disturbed by being extremely thirsty, like parched, practically to the point where you can't walk, right? And so he sees out in the middle of a forest a hut, and it's the hut of a sage. And so he, he's calling out, is anyone home? And no one answers. So he goes into the hut, maybe there's some water in there, and he sees a sage sitting there in meditation. He's actually in trance, and his eyes are half closed. He's sitting cross-legged. He's covered in sort of like skins, right, to keep warm. And he's deep in meditation. And so the king kind of calls out to him, hey, excuse me. And the sage doesn't answer. And because he's parched with thirst, he's not really thinking properly, doesn't recognize he's in trance. He thinks he's just ignoring him. And so he becomes very, very angry. And he kind of like grumbles and leaves the hut. And then when he's leaving, he sees like a dead snake, like a dried snake sitting on the forest floor. So he grabs it and goes back in the hut and places it around the sage's neck, kind of like an insult. Typically the way you honor a great person in Vedic culture is you put a garland of flowers around their neck, like in Hawaii they have the lei, they'll put around your neck. So he put a garland of a snake around his neck, and it's meant to be an insult. And later, while the king was kind of walking away, when he'd left for some time, his anger subsided. He was very regretful, like, I can't believe I've done this. This is a horrible offense. And he wasn't the only one that had heard about it. Some children apparently had passed through and seen the snake on the sage's shoulders, and they ran and told his son, Shringi. It was just a young boy, a young Brahmin boy, the son of a sage, and he's playing in a river or something with his friends. And this young boy, even though he's young, he's incredibly powerful because he's the son of a sage. And he himself has also, begun the practice of spiritual purification. And at that time, just the words of a Brahmin or the words of a spiritual personality were very powerful. It's a principle that if you perform austerity of speech, like you don't tell lies and things like that, and you only speak spiritually, then your words develop power. And then when you pronounce those words, you can affect the nature of reality. And so when Shringi hears about this, that his father's been dishonored, he becomes very angry. And he's angry because of pride. He thinks that the warrior class are so far below the priests that they should, they're like servants. And how dare this servant do this to my father? But it's more like he's angry because the priests have been insulted by this lowly warrior, They're lower than me, right? And so it's the pride of the Brahmanas. And this is considered how the influence of Kali entered into the world, is through the pride of the Brahmanas, right? Thinking that they're superior to everyone. And you could see in India, you have the Varnashram system degraded into the caste system, where it's like your position is based not upon your qualities and your propensities, but upon your birth. And those individuals born in higher caste families are very proud of, their birth and everything like this. So this is considered how that influence of materialism entered into this spiritual culture through pride and materialistic, conceptualization based upon the body. And so this young boy Shringi, he touched the water of the river and he cursed Pariksit that, you've hung this snake around my father's neck. In 7 days, I curse you to die by the bite of a snake. And not just a regular snake, it's a snake bird, a takshaka, sort of like a winged snake, almost like a dragon. And this dragon takshaka is a particular individual. He's like a celestial serpent who's in some sense has a wicked nature. And, he's very devious in many ways. And he's extremely powerful. Like if he bites you, his venom is so strong, you'll burst into flames. In fact, there's certain stories where he exhibits this. He'll bite a tree, and the tree will just burst into flames. And so this is a very powerful, sort of like celestial serpent. And so, he curses the king to be killed in this way. And then the young boy, he runs home to his father, who's known as Shamika Rishi. And he sees the snake around his neck, and he shouts, oh my gosh, right? Oh, he like wails at seeing this. And then that brings the sage out of his meditation. And the sage kind of looks down, sees the snake, and just kind of picks it up himself and throws it aside. And then he asks his son, what's wrong? Are you okay? Has something happened to you? And the son is like, no, this king put this snake around your neck. And then he's kind of like, and, what's wrong? Who cares? I don't care. It's a snake. He didn't really even care at all. Like, he's not even offended. Because he's a true Brahmin. And Brahmins are very forgiving, compassionate, detached. And, but he could see that his son is all disturbed, and he became angry at his son. I can't believe you cursed the king. He's not just a king even, he's an emperor. He's not just a normal man, and he's the great personality. And on top of this king is a great servant of Vishnu. He's a great devotee. And this is a big offense. Like, you've ruined the whole kingdom. You've done this horrible thing just for some small little offense. Like basically, when you're dealing with a great personality like Pariksit, you have to see them from a particular perspective, and understand there's greater forces at work here. And you just ignored all of this, and out of anger and pride, you killed him. You killed the king, and so he was very upset at his son. And then when Pariksit, as we said, when he also, his anger subsided, he began thinking, my gosh, what have I done? I offended a Brahmin. And then he was thinking, I deserve to die. It's like, my life is worthless. Like, what's wrong with me? And then at that time, then someone arrived and told him, about this curse that's been pronounced publicly, right? A lot of people heard this. And so the news came to him that you've been cursed to die in 7 days by this snake bird, Takshaka. It's coming to bite you. And he resigned himself to the fate. He thought, yes, this is just, I deserve this sort of thing. And not only that, this is Vishnu's mercy, right? That he's providing me with an opportunity to become detached from the world and just focus on him completely. And so this is a very important lesson in the Srimad Bhagavatam. He's the main listener. He's the main hearer, like when the Srimad Bhagavatam is being spoken by Shukadeva Goswami in the midst of the assembly, Pariksit is the one who's listening. It's like being spoken for his benefit. Everyone else is listening too, but he's listening with an incredible intensity. He's given up all of his attachments. He's recognized that death is coming in a very short time, and he has no control over it. And he's willing, though, to become detached from the world, recognize that the world is temporary and illusory, and that these attachments are basically holding his consciousness into matter. And that now, recognizing that death is coming, I have to let go of all these attachments and just absorb myself very intensely in hearing these stories or pastimes of Vishnu, and hearing the name of Vishnu, and hearing the qualities of Vishnu. Basically absorb myself in an intense devotional practice of hearing. And in doing so, then I'll prepare myself to leave this world and leave its attachments and enter into the spiritual world and achieve spiritual perfection. And so he really is an example of the intensity at which one should hear the Srimad Bhagavatam and the detachment towards the world that one should have to achieve that intensity, and the recognition of the temporary nature of reality and the need to leave it behind for ultimate spiritual liberation. And so he really shows kind of like the eagerness, like the extreme desire to absorb in hearing and to become detached. And so what he did was he decided to sit by the bank of a sacred river, Jamuna, which is outside Delhi, which is Hastinapur, which is the kingdom that was where his kingdom was. He lived in Delhi 5,000 years ago. And so he went by the sacred river, and he had the determination to fast unto death. He was just going to sit there and meditate and hear and chant until his death came. And immediately as he sits down like this, all of a sudden all these sages start coming out of everywhere. The thousands of sages are coming out of the forest and stuff and surrounding him. And so they, through their meditation, they understood that something great is about to happen. That first of all, they came to support the king. They know he's a great devotee and everything, but they know that the Bhagavatam, the Srimad Bhagavatam, is about to be spoken. And so they all arrive at the same time. As we said, there's Vyasadeva there, Narada there. And the king sees them and he welcomes them all and pays his respects and offers his obeisances to them. And then with folded hands, he begins to essentially pray to them and say, please, will you instruct me what a man should do at the time of death? What is his duty? Please give me instruction about what I should do now that death is coming upon me. And as soon as he says this, then Shukadeva Goswami immediately appears through the forest, and then all the sages stand, right? And then it is the sages defer to him that he's going to instruct Pariksit. And so Shukadeva Goswami seats himself upon the Vyasasan, or the seat of Vyas, the seat of instruction. And Maharaj Pariksit then sits before him, and all the sages sit down and begin to listen to the telling of the Srimad Bhagavatam. So thank you very much for listening. If you found value in this, please like and subscribe. If you're listening on iTunes, please visit srisachinandan.com/iTunes and leave a positive review. Thank you again, and we hope you'll join us next time on Light of the Vedas.